Are ready to get going. So welcome. This is one of 3 sessions this afternoon, and we are focusing on hedgerow habitats today. We have got Rosie Maple, who is My Wild City Conservation Officer for the Avon Wildlife Trust and lives and breathes these issues every single day. Rosie's going to be presenting to us about the benefits of our hedgerows and how we can enhance them in our parks. And then after Rosie's finished, we have Clary, who is part of Sustainable Southmead and has in particular been working on an exciting project in Trim Valley. So to kick off with, I'm going to hand over to Rosie. Rosie?
All right, thanks for having me, Charlie. It's a pleasure to be here. Like Charlie already said, my name is Rosie and I work for Avon Wildlife Trust on a project called My Wild City. So I work in partnership with Bristol City Council on a number of local wildlife sites within Bristol. The project aims to develop sustainable management, conservation in some of the most nature-rich spots in the city, and also to create new groups and support existing community groups to carry on this work into the future. So I am here to talk about a subject that I'm really passionate about, which is hedgerow habitats and how some of the different ways in which we can manage them. So I'm going to kind of start the talk. I'm going to chat about hedgerow natural history and their importance and value for wild species. And then I'm going to move on to talking about hedges in more urbanised settings, hedgerows in parks, local wildlife sites. And we'll talk through some of the ways which community groups can help to get involved in restoring and maintaining or creating new hedgerows. We'll think about some of the different scenarios that you might be working with and look at a few examples from the My Wild City project. So do bear with me with this presentation malarkey. Here we go. Right, so hedgerows are one of the most ubiquitous habitats in the UK. They're not unique to Britain, but they certainly are one of the most kind of iconic features of our rural, urban and suburban landscapes. Their relative abundance over the millennia has kind of waxed and waned in accordance with social and political changes. And this mainly relates to kind of systems of land ownership. We've had eras of mass planting and then later mass removal and then areas of replanting. I won't go into the history of enclosure or the history of hedgerows too much here because it's a very long subject, but I'll provide a list of kind of further reading at the end of the talk for those who are interested. So at the moment, hedgerow abundance is in decline. The most recent spate of mass hedgerow loss coincided with the full-scale mechanisation of farming, so after the end of World War II. And this is where we saw kind of larger fields with fewer boundaries becoming more economical to manage. So this was as machinery started to take over from draft animals. So there would have been a big reduction in the labour force that was required to farm, and so not so many hands to constantly tend and repair the hedges. If we fast forward to the present day, as agricultural systems tend to focus on kind of high production and yield, the land used is providing less and less space for nature. So I think it's safe to say that actually, even though we've lost, over 50% since World War II, that hedgerows might be kind of reaching their zenith in terms of their kind of overall importance for safeguarding biodiversity in the UK. So what is a hedgerow and what is it for? So hedges are one of the most versatile and varied habitats, and they can therefore be quite difficult to accurately categorise. Most obviously, hedgerow creates a linear boundary. It's a tool used by people to enclose, divide and separate land, historically to keep livestock in and predators or poachers out. They can denote the edges of one's property, a parish boundary, and they can provide shelter from the elements, and obviously they're rich foraging grounds for animals and people alike. So the variety in the form and the composition of hedgerows is pretty staggering. So John Wright's Natural History of the Hedgerow states that if one were to compile, an exhaustive list of all the plants that could be found in a hedgerow, you would essentially be listing pretty much every plant found in the UK. And this is a pretty remarkable statement, but it starts to make a little bit more sense when you consider the variety of forms that hedgerows may come in different parts of the country. So hedgerows are often combined with other habitat features to improve their effectiveness as a field boundary. So if you, for example, if you take a drive across the North Somerset levels, you are all too aware of the kind of deep water-filled drainage ditches that often run in tandem with roadside hedges. And so these would have originally been a function to kind of drain the swampy land for grazing, but they're also full of freshwater aquatic plants and invertebrates such as dragonfly. If you were to head southeast into the Chew Valley, and suddenly the hedgerows are kind of elevated above on steep banks or set back on gently sloping grassy verges, and these play host to kind of an array of wildflower species. So these are plants that are more commonly associated with grassy meadows. Sometimes hedgerows include all three of these extra topographical features. So you've got a bank sloping down into a permanently or periodically wet ditch, and then this levels out onto a verge. So you can see kind of a cross-section of that in the diagram. So this ditch bank combination was an artifact of their construction. You're digging a ditch to improve your ability to keep your sheep in. Where are you going to put that earth? You're going to put it to one side and then plant the hedge on top of it. So if you take a stroll in any ancient woodlands around the county, you're likely to find a similar situation. So linear lines of trees situated on banks, carpeted with bluebells, wood anemone, wild garlic and other woodland indicator species. Also kind of old byways and footpaths with the double hedgerow border. These almost always include a bank on both sides. So this is something that is quite uniquely British, the green lane. And these lovely green passages, they're particularly special in terms of how species rich they are. Normally there'll be a shaded side and a sunny side, areas of nutrient richness beneath the trees, offset with very nutrient poor areas. So they're really quite special because there's a lot of variance in soil pH, nutrient richness, relative moisture levels, and this can vary quite a lot over quite a small footprint. So this increases the number of ecological niches available for wildlife. So I'm going to have a talk about some of the more common hedgerow trees and shrubs. So I've already said the variance of the plants found in hedgerows is very diverse. However, when looking at the composition of the shrubs that make up the hedge itself, there are a few species that are often dominant constituents. So hawthorn and blackthorn, which I'm sure many of you have encountered if you do any scrub clearance on your sites, they make fabulous barriers due to their ability to grow into dense thickets and the presence of kind of formidable spikes. They coppice and they lay pretty effectively, but they also respond well to trimming. So they've been chosen for their ability to keep livestock well contained, but their defensiveness also very attractive, is a very attractive attribute for small birds. All sorts of things to nest in. So they're perfect for small birds to create nests in, and there's about 60 species of bird in total that have been found to nest in hawthorn and blackthorn hedges. The blossom that these trees produce early in the spring means that huge swathes of the countryside are really well connected and producing kind of tons of nectar and pollen for insects on the wing early in the season. Mammals such as dormice will also eat the blossoms. So this is an initial food source after emerging from hibernation. Butterflies like the brown and also black hair streak, they need a supply of young blackthorn shoots to lay their eggs on. So within this dense thicket, other animals can create a kind of network of trails. In the centre are really wide hedges that these could be used by rodents, small deer, foxes, badgers, other mustelids, to move around the landscape under cover. So come autumn time, hawthorn and blackthorn become very easily distinguishable. So you've got the red berries of hawthorn, and this really does provide a bounty for common birds like blackbird, finches, and winter visitors like redwing and fieldfare. And then the dark blue sloes of blackthorn are a favourite of starlings and pigeons, and also us for creating sloe gin. So they're particularly, I think these two species really are, they're particularly important as they are a reliable food source that lasts throughout the winter. So from blackthorn blossoming in March, hawthorn in May, through to the last berries that drop off or get nibbled in winter, they're pretty much supplying some sort of nutrition to animals all year round. In the height of summer, these species play host to an abundance of tiny invertebrates, from kind of leaf mining micromoths to the caterpillars like the lackey and the light emerald moth. So hawthorn alone is known to support about 300 species of insect, many of which rely on it as an exclusive larval food plant. Next slide. So another incredibly common hedgerow tree is hazel. So hazel trees, unlike the thorny species, have beautifully smooth stems and they grow in abundance once that maiden stem has been cut back or disturbed. It really is the perfect tree for sustainable timber harvest. When it's coppiced or laid into a hedge, a proliferation of stems will kind of burst from around the cut surface, the stem and again the root ball. The wood is flexible, it's really strong, it grows incredibly straight and quickly, so it's particularly lovely to work with when hedge laying. The speed of growth means that once every seven or 8 years growth has occurred, quite large gaps in the hedge could easily be blocked up again. So hazel is particularly notable for the variety of fungi that grow in association with it. So scarlet elf cups are one that you may have noticed recently as it fruits around January and February. Other slightly less conspicuous species include summer truffles and hazel woodwort. And again, hazel trees can be a prolific producer of fruit in the autumn. So hazelnuts are again a favourite food of dormice and of squirrels as well. So some of the other very common species of woody trees or shrubs and also the climbing plants, climbing vines that are common sites in hedgerows pretty much everywhere include bramble, holly, ivy, field maple, spindle gorse, yew, dog rose, honeysuckle, beech, elder, hornbeam, willow and apple. Interesting, there's only one species of plant that is known to grow only in hedgerow habitats, and this is one of Britain's rarest trees, the Plymouth pear. Like I said, it's incredibly rare, confined to areas around Plymouth and Truro, although it is slightly more widespread on the continent. So if you combine this kind of plethora of lower growing shrubs with the associated kind of grassy banks of ditches, and then add in the kind of the standard trees, the large trees like the oaks and the ash, you've got an incredibly diverse selection of species and ecological niches for pretty much all taxa. So I think for me, what really is the most special thing about hedges is that they are in effect linear strips of woodland edge. So to quote John Wright again, hedges are all edges. We've known for quite a long time that the edge of a woodland, be it the exterior edge of the block or the edge of a large kind of grassy glade or ride within climactic canopy woodlands, they're by far the most biodiverse areas within these habitats. So the dark interiors of woods just don't support the same number of species. Once those taller trees of the woodland, they form that more closed canopy, the density of the understory growth and woodland plants quickly starts to decline. Another interesting point to note is that trees in the interior of woodlands do not fruit anywhere near as regularly as those that enjoy those comparatively higher light levels on the edges. So this has got really massive implications for any animals foraging for nectar, seeds and fruit. And it's why the research has found that you will find more species within the first 10 metres of a woodland edge than in all of its remaining interior, which is quite remarkable. As a bit of a side note, this is also why it's really important for people and organisations who own or manage woodlands to be able to fell coppice trees and just disturb woodland habitats generally. This is in the absence of kind of large herbivores like oryx and bison, which would have had a job in this, which would have had a hand in this job thousands of years ago. So I'll have a quick run through of how some of the other ways that animals use hedgerows. So we've already talked about the kind of brilliant nesting habitat that hedges provide for all sorts of birds. Rather endearingly, we're not the only ones who use hedgerows as a means of dividing up land. Several studies have found that birds also use hedgerows to denote territory edges, which I think is rather sweet. Aside from being primary habitat for some species, the importance of hedgerows in assisting the movement and dispersal of species really can't be understated. So since the intensification of agriculture after the Second World War, many hectares of land that would once have included species-rich hay meadows or kind of like valuable areas of waste or fallow land that had lots of resources for wildlife would have been ploughed up for crops or reseeded with highly productive grasses. These kind of monocultures really are green deserts. So the amount of land available to support this large variety of plants, insects and other animals was drastically reduced, and importantly, the remaining ones became isolated, these isolated pockets of marginal land which became fragmented. So this makes those small populations very highly vulnerable to local extinctions. That could be from an extreme weather event, a localized disease outbreak. Without that connectivity of similar habitats, it could be impossible for outside individuals to recolonize an area. If, for instance, for example, it's a copse of woodland that's surrounded by arable fields, or, for instance, a local wildlife site in an urban area that's surrounded by residential housing with maybe the gardens are particularly sterile, and an industrial estate. So, gardens have got a big role to play in this as well. So what hedgerows do provide is this kind of like arterial network of highways where species like butterflies, bumblebees, newts, hedgehogs and dormice can move safely and with quite a decent food and nesting provision along the way, and hopefully eventually find a larger patch of suitable habitat to support them. And this is going to become really, really important as kind of climate change progresses, for species to be able to track north, track south as the climate changes. So hedgerows also provide a windbreak and many feeding opportunities. So they generally support higher numbers of flying insects. And this is both in the day and in the night time. So as a result of this, taller hedges are of particular importance to many species of bat, both common species like pipistrelles, long-eared bats, and also species of conservation concern such as greater horseshoe. There's also evidence that bats with a shorter echolocation range will actually use a well-connected network of hedges as a navigation tool, so to make their way from the roost to their favourite feeding sites elsewhere. Again, those older standard hedgerow trees, those large oaks and ash trees that are mature enough to include rot holes, that really important deadwood habitat, bits of flaky bark. These are also providing kind of important roosting sites in and of themselves. So, going to move on to looking at creation and restoration of hedgerows in urban parks and wildlife sites. So how do you decide if a hedgerow is right for your park? When is it suitable to create hedgerow habitat, and when should we allow them to develop without intervention? And when could we improve or restore outgrown hedges? So there are quite a lot of factors that will affect this decision-making process, and I certainly cannot foresee all of the possible scenarios, but I can give you an idea of the right questions to ask, and maybe the right questions to ask and who to direct them to. So reasons that you might have for planting or restoring a hedgerow in an urban park include creating a living barrier. So this could be a boundary line around the edge of the site or internally to kind of divide up two habitats. Maybe you've got sort of a grassy meadow patch and then a patch of woodland, and you'd like to improve the ecotope, the transition between those two habitats. They can help reduce, improving the conservation value and or the visual impact of something like a fence line. Reducing vandalism, you know, if you're going to plant up a load of hawthorn and blackthorn, this can kind of prevent, if you do have issues with things like people cutting fences, people climbing over fences and damaging the infrastructure. They can help reduce footfall on ecologically sensitive areas. So it may be, you know, a particularly special bit of meadow that's getting trampled. So you can encourage visitors to stick to the paths, reduce the creation of desire lines, compaction and erosion. And that might be, you know, a problem that's getting bigger, what with lockdown and kind of increased footfall on a lot of these reserves. And also just to connect up a gappy or fragmented hedgerow. So, you know, you might see it on your site, or you can look on Google Earth and you can kind of detect and work out where these old hedgerows used to be, and try and connect them back up again. So I'm going to start by looking at hedgerow restoration through hedge laying, and we'll look at a few examples from My Wild City project. So many local wildlife sites, particularly those have been managed with wildlife conservation in mind, rather than kind of primarily recreational use, will contain at least some really old hedgerows. So if your primary reason for creating new hedgerow habitat is to benefit wildlife, then I really do urge you to consider restoring an old hedge before wanting to create lots of new ones. So the reason for this is the trees and shrubs that make up these historical hedges will be well established. They'll have spreading roots and a network of associations with fungi in the soil. They may well have associated features like the banks and the ditches that we spoke about. And these might still be quite species rich, or at least have the potential to be. So even if you don't find a bank that supports a range of other plant species, it might be permanent shading, the outgrown trees has suppressed these extra species, and that an increase in the light levels from this management will be enough to stimulate regeneration. So where local wildlife sites exist on the outskirts or the suburbs of a city, there may be a history of agricultural activity that ceased around the time when the residential areas were first constructed. I mean, if you take a look at the picture on the left, does this look like a familiar site? Linear lines of trees, whether consistent or gappy, this could indicate a previously laid or trimmed hedge. So they can be really obvious, as they could still form the edge of a field that is grazed or hay cut. They could have been engulfed in encroaching or spreading secondary woodland. So, have a look for some signs that these hedges were once laid. So the picture in the middle there, this obviously wasn't taken in Bristol, but it is my favourite example, the most extreme example I know of signs that a hedgerow was once laid. And these are now, veteran trees with all the associated features of being hundreds of years old. But that picture in the middle is a field maple. I'm not sure how old it is, but, well over 100 years old, with these bizarre kind of horizontal trunks. And that was taken on top of Burlage Hill Fort in Chew Valley. So that's an Iron Age hill fort. I don't think the trees are quite that old. But yeah, that's the most extreme example I've ever seen. And I just think they're weird and wonderful structures. So, where are we? So if you are able to identify some situations like this, like looking at the picture I put down from Dundry Slopes, then there are a few important things to think about before you start. So can this hedge be laid immediately, or are the trees now too large? So the jury's kind of out on how big is too big to lay. But if you've got a hedge that contains a lot of hazel, hawthorn or blackthorn, or any of the other species I've mentioned, stems of around up to 10 to 15 centimetres in diameter, then this could be a good candidate for laying in its current state. Any bigger than this, and you're going to have a really tough job. I'd say 15 centimetres. You don't want all of the stems to be that thick, a few, fine. So any bigger than this, you're really going to have a difficult time, even with a chainsaw, as the stems need to be of a handleable size when you are kind of dropping and arranging the timber. So because of the weight of it, the timber becomes less pliable and flexible. So you may well end up with a lot of kind of twisted off stems and a messy torn stump. And this is going to be an increased risk of death through kind of fungal rot. So in these situations where maybe the stems are too large, I think the best way to restore the hedge will be through coppicing and allowing that stall to regrow, for maybe about 5 to 7 years, something like that. And then you'll have a manageable size to work with. So if you look at the picture on the right, this is an example from Stockwood Open Space in Bristol. We did a bit of a mix and match with this one. So we had a larger hazel and a larger field maple that we decided to coppice out. We thought it's too big for laying. And then a row of kind of thorn trees and more maple trees and a couple more hazel and a holly that were the right size for laying. So we laid part of it, coppiced the rest, and then that can be laid in several years' time. And then there was a lovely kind of boundary, what denotes kind of the corner of this hedge, a large apple tree left as a standard in the background. So you can mix and match a little bit. So obviously it's quite a lot of work, and it does require a bit of a longish term commitment, certainly if you're coppicing with the intention to lay again. But if it doesn't really matter whether it's a physical boundary anymore or not, it's still positive to coppice some of these larger trees, as it allows light to reach the flora beneath. You don't need to be coppicing on a cycle any shorter than 15 years for things like hazel, and then you get really good wildlife benefit. And it may be that you can start that coppicing cycle, and then some years down the line, even if it's not the same individual, that can be laid in later on and more manageable. So an ideal hedge for laying is one with trees with stems between about 5 and 10 centimetres. If you're lucky to identify an easily layable hedge, then it is worth considering seeking further training or funding to get a professional hedge layer in to help you. So it's quite a skill. It takes time and practice. It's really, really good fun. So if you've got the opportunity to, I'd really recommend it. If the trees are really outgrown, it is probably going to require a chainsaw to be effective. So you need at least kind of one trained and experienced person is required to make sure it's done safely. So I've included some pictures that illustrate pretty well how you can open up an area using this technique. So the two pictures at the top is a bit of a before and after from Mike Reed hedge laying contractor. So you can see it makes quite a difference to an area. It can look quite drastic initially, but I think that's all part of this kind of cyclic nature of hedgerow habitats. So to stress them out once every kind of two or three decades is not a problem. This is actually really good to help new species get established, and you just let all that light in, and you bolster the populations of plants on the bank. Down at the bottom, we've got a few pictures of just some of the tools that are involved. So if they are outgrown, you will need a chainsaw, but there's, lots of the smaller stems only really require an axe or some bill hooks, and to create those pleacher cuts. So a pleacher cut is essentially, you're just cutting through the back of the stem and leaving a small strip of the cambium, so the actual kind of living tissue. And then once you've laid it into the hedge, you'll create a kind of lattice of living wood. So you'll get vertical side shoots coming up and creating that density. So I've included an infographic from the People's Trust for Endangered Species, and this can help you kind of decide what sort of management is needed. So on the right, they've got loads of really, really great practical how-to guides for pretty much any scenario. So on the right is a selection of kind of overly trimmed hedges, with very leggy at the bottom, often gappy, and they kind of look like a bonsai tree. You can see how they're kind of been over managed. On the left shows another common scenario of trees that are outgrown, and the central circle is showing you what you're really aiming for. So that density with the correct level of intervention through trimming and reshaping. And then we'll move on to looking at creating, constraints to laying hedges. Yeah, so just to bear in mind, it requires training to do effectively and safely. At least one person should be trained on a chainsaw if it's an outgrown hedge. It can be quite physically demanding, but there's plenty of smaller, lighter work needed. So that's including stake making, cutting of smaller pleachers, weaving and trimming. It can be quite time consuming, but it's something that you could split out over 2 or 3 years. And it does produce quite a lot of excess brush. So, you know, this does require processing like dragging and piling. So creating a new hedge. So we've got a few examples from My Wild City. You know, if you do identify the need or desire to create new hedgerow habitat, there are some important points to think about prior to the work commencing. So what extra materials other than whips and spades you will need. So if you've got a high level of deer or rabbit activity, plastic tree guards are going to be required. So it's just making sure that you can ensure that somebody will be around to take these off when it's required. Once the hedge is grown, who's going to be responsible for managing and maintaining it? If the council are going to be required to help you, it's just thinking ahead as to what machinery is going to be needed to manage it effectively. Do they have the correct access, be it vehicle access or kind of, you know, an operative with hedge trimmers? And do they have the resources to give you a hand? You know, shorts, you know, a good example here, you know, of kind of well thought out hedge planting was at Coombrooke Valley in Clay Hill. So this hedge is about 6 years old now and it's doing really, really well. But it's just connecting up an existing hedgerow. So planting up the gaps, you know, that's really, really easy to manage. And it doesn't mean that there are like loads of resources going in to managing a new habitat. One thing that is really difficult to foresee sometimes is, will the hedgerow interfere with overground or underground services? So think about power lines, so always look up, underground cables or sewage pipes, and will the hedgerow interfere with other important habitat management regimes such as hay cutting? So what we don't want is kind of, you know, lovely meadows being divided up by rows of trees if it involves a big tractor that can't get in and turn around and do the cutting properly. So if you can't foresee any issues, then the next step will be to speak to your council's conservation officer, the relevant land managers, and or other organisations like the Wildlife Trusts or more specialist groups like BART, the Bristol and Avon Rivers Trust, if it's in a kind of riparian habitat, and they can give you advice depending on the situation, help you source whips in a responsible way. So finally, I've just got a summary and some do's and don'ts. So do source your whips responsibly when hedge planting. So native status and local provenance is really, really important, especially for species such as hawthorn. So hawthorn's kind of very well known for being very adapted to local conditions. So it might not even be good enough to, even if the whips don't come from overseas, having hawthorn that was really growing quite locally is important to ensure that it lives for a long time. A really good way to do this would be to try and source your whips from naturally occurring scrubby saplings on site. So I don't know if many of you have ever used tree poppers before, or you can kind of dig them up. You know, most groups will spend time doing scrub clearance on meadows where blackthorn and hawthorn are encroaching. You know, this is a great way to ensure that the trees themselves are adapted to the local conditions. Do consult your local authority, park managers, other relevant conservation organisations for advice on the species mix and the right locations for hedgerows. Do ensure that relevant training and practical help is available before laying or planting. Carry out all your management work, whether creative or restorative, between October and February, because this is when the trees are dormant and most kind of, you know, it's outside of bird nesting season, so minimum impact on other wildlife. And once it's kind of restored or planted, do allow your hedge to develop without annual intervention. So trimming once every 3 years, 3 or 4 years if possible. And this just means that all of the shrubs have a chance to flower and fruit and also thicken up properly, so get the most benefits for wildlife. And do check out online resources. Like I said, People's Trust for Endangered Species are just incredible when it comes to kind of practical how-to guides. And then kind of other organisations such as TCB do a range of practical handbooks as well. Things to not do and watch out for include kind of planting hedges in heavily shaded areas or in woodlands. They're not going to succeed. Don't ever plant non-native or invasive species. You know, this is something that the council or park managers can help you with. Don't plant species that naturally grow huge as your only or main constituent to your hedge. So if you did want to add standard trees like oak, obviously, you know, whoever's going to be managing that part for the next kind of half century is going to want to know about that. But also, you know, you don't want, it would be something that punctuates the hedge rather than the main constituent. And just think about the landscape and the next 10 or 20 years in terms of when and where you're planting. So for example, you know, what's the land use, work with the landscape. So I've put in the example of kind of, if you created a kind of double hedgerow of hawthorn or blackthorn on a narrow track, and then you've got a school on one side and a park on the other, you know, that's probably not the best idea. So just think about the right species in the right place, and yeah, have fun. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rosie. That was absolutely fascinating. So much detail in there. It was brilliant.
Thank you for having me, Charlie. It's great.
Not at all. So we've got loads of questions for you to start off with. We've got about 10 minutes. Oh, sorry. 10 minutes of question time for Rosie. And Rosie, if you want to stop sharing your screen, we'll be able to see you a bit better.
Yeah.
So I will kick off. Let's have a look. Where shall we start? So Francis at Baddocks Wood has got a hedgerow that seems to be particularly popular for bats. They seem to feed above it and one on a neighbouring site. Do you have any tips for managing hedgerows for bats?
Generally, hedgerow, the taller the better. So it's going to be managing that balance between keeping it dense and consistent, but also not over managing and keeping it slightly taller. So yeah, certainly for a range of species, this does seem to be the thing, is keeping it nice and thick and consistent. So actually, essentially, it's ensuring that it's not getting too leggy at the bottom, and that the trees involved are not shading each other out, and create, you know, you get that thing of, you know, you plant too many things too close together, and eventually, without intervention, some will die off, and you'll end up with 2 or 3 trees being dominant. So you want to keep it nice and dense, but also, you know, if somebody's coming around and cutting that annually, you want to be encouraging a regime of cutting maybe every 4 years, something like that. But yeah, nice tall hedges. So quite often for bats, it's just ensuring that it kind of just maintaining that consistency, really.
Thank you. So Harry Mack would like to know, do you ever, there's 2 questions here. So do you mulch or weed your hedges? And do you ever plant climbers, or do you wait for them to move in naturally?
I would probably just say that let succession do its thing. I'm quite adverse to trying to micromanage habitats like this. I'd say that your job as the local community group is to think about the species mix of the trees and the shrubs that are going to make up the woody constituent, and then just let other things, whatever wants to be there will find its way there, essentially. So certainly when it comes to things like, you know, in more urban areas, you're likely to get ivy and bramble and things like that, and there's nothing wrong with that. You know, if you don't have this incredibly diverse mix of, you know, bryonies and honeysuckle and things like that, I don't think you have to worry. I think there's still a lot of value in just the more common species like hawthorn, blackthorn, hazel, bramble. Quite often you're going to end up with things like rosebay willow herb. You know, there's a high diversity in urban hedgerows. You've just got to make sure that you are keeping away invasive non-native. So, you know, if a hedgerow is starting to become swamped out with things like Himalayan balsam, Japanese knotweed, bindweed is another one that can really kind of take over. I don't think I have any answers for managing bindweed. It's an absolute nightmare. But yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about the climbing vines. I think whatever wants to be there will find its way there eventually.
Thank you. And Clary would like to know, is there an optimum or minimum width for a hedgerow?
I think most of the planting, you know, it depends on the situation. And I think it depends on it depends on the place in which you're planting it. So I think a lot of the practical how-to guides generally kind of stay 30 centimetres between trees, and then you will double plant. So you'll stagger, you'll have one row and then another row offset, a bit like brickwork. You know, and then that between those two rows, you're looking at about 60 centimetres in between. And this is just to get that nice density going. But I think you can kind of play around with that, with those numbers, depending upon the situation, really. You know, they do recommend kind of planting quite dense to start off with, but this is based on the fact that you're assuming a certain amount of mortality from the saplings. Quite often you see hedgerows where there's like zero mortality, and actually sometimes that's too dense. So I think, yeah, spacing your two rows out by a metre, you know, 60 centimetres to a metre to get a slightly wider hedge. I do think the wider the better, really, but it's just about thinking about the situation you're in. Is it going to become a problem for management? Is it going to close up gaps on a footpath that's going to require cutting 2 or 3 times a year? Those are the kind of things you want to think about. It's not in an urban place, but I don't know if many of you have been kind of keeping up to date on what's been going on at NEP down in West Sussex, the rewilding project. You know, they're taking hedgerows to a new extreme, you know, 20, 25 metre, you know, letting the hedgerows turn into kind of secondary woodland. And that's where all the nightingales want to be now, and finding out they're not even woodland species necessarily. That's just where they were clinging on. And actually these huge, wide, diverse hedgerows, you know, it's just, they're great for so many things. So yeah, read the landscape, really. And I think anything from kind of 60 centimetres to a metre width is good to start with.
Thank you. Caroline Enyon from Bristol Parks North, works for the council, is asking, so one of the low intervention nature increasing actions that they're looking at taking next year is to cut back hedges less, allowing them to billow out into green spaces more, which, based on what you've been saying, sounds really positive. Are there hedges or hedge species that this will be more effective for?
Pretty much everything. I can't think of one that doesn't really benefit from this practice. It's all to do with the rate that hedgerow species will flower and set seed, berries or fruit. So, you know, certainly in the country, or, you know, roadside hedges where they get trimmed annually every single year, and they get this really kind of stunted, gappy feel to them. And you don't often see a massive hawthorn and blackthorn flowers on hedges like this. And they just look a bit manicured, and they're not that thick as well. Quite often you can kind of see through them. I can't think of a single species that wouldn't benefit from cutting on a regime over a larger amount of time. Yeah, every 3 years, every 4 years is perfect. And if you don't have to, then, you know, you're doing less work, so, and benefiting, so it's all good.
Brilliant. So Jerry Dicker would like to know, traditionally they cut elder out of hedges as it makes the hedge gappy in winter, but it is also good for biodiversity. So what do you think? What would you say?
Yeah, I've heard this as well. It's a funny one. I actually thought it was because of its brittleness when laying, and that it just kind of snaps out. Elder also kind of likes to grow up at the base of things like hawthorn and blackthorn. I love elder. I don't think it's something that we should be getting rid of out of hedgerows, especially if we're talking about, you know, local wildlife sites. You know, we are thinking about food and foraging resource for animals, but also for people as well. And, you know, that's a really great way to get people out on site, is to collect elderflower wine. Well, not collect the wine, but collect the flowers to make, you know, forage and make wild foods. I wouldn't plant it, potentially, because I think it can take over. Yeah, I've never seen a kind of majorly elder hedge that is massively gappy, but that is certainly kind of ancient wisdom of hedge layers, is to cut it out first. So not actually sure on that one, but, you know, I like elder, so leave it be if it's there, but I probably wouldn't plant it as a constituent of the hedge if you're creating one.
Brilliant, thank you. Good question from Clive. So Clive would like to know, should it be a conservation priority to plant more hedgerows, or should we be focusing on maintaining existing ones?
It's an amazing question. I think it doesn't even just go for hedgerows. I think it goes for pretty much all habitats. I think we need to preserve what we've got before we're creating new. It's going to take a long time for a hedgerow, a newly planted hedgerow, to become kind of really amazing for wildlife in the same way. Like, they're such an ancient habitat. Like, even if they've kind of turned into woodland, you know, these are communities of plants that have been in that state for potentially hundreds of years. And there's a lot of diversity and complexity that we can't see with the naked eye. So, you know, we're only just learning about kind of mycorrhizal fungi in the soil and all the kind of benefits that plants get from those connections between these two types of organism. I always say we need to be putting more emphasis on preserving and maintaining good quality habitats rather than pouring that money into creating new ones. That doesn't mean that creation isn't a good thing in the right place, but I just think the emphasis is a bit off kilter at the moment, and that people really want to feel like they're doing something good for nature. And quite often, you know, that creative thing of putting a tree in the ground, you know, it's a very clear link that, you know, you feel like I have created something, I am putting something back. But actually, quite often, it's a bit counterintuitive. You know, coppicing or hedgeling, it feels destructive. You're cutting something down, or you're stressing an environment out. And actually, you know, that is really, really important. You know, we don't have huge herbivores roaming the landscape who would have caused that disturbance. Like, creating the cyclical nature of habitats like this is like incredibly important for biodiversity, for new plants and animals to kind of establish. Disturbance is good. So yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. Thanks, Clive. Oh, you're on mute, Charlie.
Thank you. So we've just about run out of time for questions for you verbally, but Rosie, it'd be great if you could hang on and answer the rest of the questions that haven't been answered in the chat box.
Yeah,
that would
fantastic.
be lovely. Thank you so much. I mean, you're so unbelievably knowledgeable on this topic. I feel like I know everything that there could be to know about hedgerows, and all in the space of just 40 minutes. So really, really good stuff. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to hand over to Clary now, who is going to tell us about her project with Sustainable Southmead at Trim Valley. Clary, over to you.
Hi, nice to see everybody. Just going to share my screen. Is that working fine, Charlie?
Yeah, that looks good.
Great. So hi everyone, I'm Clary. I just want to tell you a little about what we've been doing in the Trim Valley with our tiny forest. And I wanted to start off just by saying that this isn't my job. I'm resident volunteer, so nothing professional at all. And really, when we got going, it was because I started to be quite interested in wildlife and rewilding and doing something like that, and realized that I've got a little scrappy piece of land just by me, 600 meters worth of riverside, which is mown and fly tipping and shortcut, really. And it felt like, well, maybe we could do something better. And I kind of went on a couple of litter picks down there, but really wanted to see if there's a way that we could make that better for wildlife. So I started to try and kind of contact the council and emailed them, and everything disappeared into the ether and I never heard back. So I then went round the local groups to see if I could find out who was in charge of that bit of land or who looked after it. I visited Sustainable Westbury on Trim, who were fab and told me all about their Trout in the Trim project, which is about restoring the river back to the level where it can sustain a habitat for wild trout, which I thought was so exciting, and was like, can I get on board? Can I be involved at the Southmead end? And they're really supportive. I went to BS10 Parks and Planning, which turned out to be much more about planning than about parks, but I made some really good links there and met someone who introduced me to Team Southmead, which is our resident group. They have a really wide remit, but when I told them about Trout in the Trim and about improving the area again, they were super enthusiastic and said, yeah, just go for it. Create like a sustainable Southmead group. So I did. And at this point, it was me and a couple of mates who I'd roped in. But we set up a Facebook group and we set up an email account and we held an event. So we were really guided in what we wanted to do at first by the Wild Trout Trust, who'd done an advisory report, and really saying to improve the river, we needed to improve erosion, we needed to remove the Himalayan balsam. So this is us removing some of the Himalayan balsam, and then we also kind of used this to help us get some ideas about what to do, and we took a heck of a lot of litter out of it. But we also gathered more volunteers, and we gathered more people who have actually become really key people ever since. But one of the things that was super identified was that just the area needed more trees. Basically, that was the priority. And for trees, because it's council land, we had to get involved with the council. I finally managed to get in touch with some people. I managed to get on an email list that was going around, which was really helpful. And I met loads of lovely people. My experience of Bristol City Council is that everyone is great, but they never talk to each other, and they don't know each other, and they don't work together, which that was my experience. But I did manage to have a meeting on the ground with Jack McCrickard, who's from One Tree Per Child, and Jerry Cole, who was in Parks Ops at the time. And as we walked around and talked about the trees, it really felt great, because I was there saying, look, we need more trees. And I think Jack had a budget of having to plant more trees, so he wanted to plant more trees. And one of us, and we can't remember who, mentioned a tiny forest, which is an idea both of us had kind of heard about from TED Talks and YouTube, and hadn't been done in Bristol. And we just thought, yeah, great, we've got an opportunity. Let's put in Bristol's first tiny forest. So our next step was to do a community consultation, and we did this in conjunction with the council. So they drew up a lovely tree planting map for us. Here's our little map which they drew up, and we actually door knocked every single house that backed onto this area, and we put it out on social media and Facebook, and we had 97 respondents, which we were so pleased about. And as well as asking about the trees, we also found out about kind of who used that space and how often they used it and what for. But as you can see, most of the feedback we got was just overwhelmingly positive. People were really up for the idea of getting trees in the area and making the area better for wildlife. So we decided to go ahead and just do it. So over winter, we then planted trees. This wasn't the community-led planting we'd all hoped for because of COVID. So we are super grateful to the council parks volunteers who did all of our planting for us. They were just magnificent. But we had lots of different areas. So this is us planting our woodland trees. And I saw someone mentioned before about biodegradable tree covers. So everything here is biodegradable and should rot away within 2 to 4 years. We will let you know how that goes. And as you can see, we've got our lovely, this is our wild hedgerow that was already there at the back. So it was so interesting hearing Rosie talk and thinking, yeah, we already have a bit of hedgerow bordering our park. So it was really lovely to hear about that. As well as our woodland trees, we've got an area which is going to be a wildflower meadow. This is our project for this coming year, is how to transform this piece of land. And this was, again, something that the conservation officer at Bristol helped us out with. She really identified that this patch of land would be much better for wildflowers than it would be for trees. So it was about learning kind of what's going to be the best use of our space. We also have some riparian woodland. And you might notice we've got loads of different funders. And again, it was Jack at the council who organised all the different funders, organised all the different whips. He was just brilliant for doing that. So we've got some riverside trees, so the rare black poplar, as well as alders and willows going in alongside our river. We have some lovely, beautiful, larger trees, some standards from the Urban Tree Challenge Fund, which have gone in. We have a community orchard. This is my little girl. She's adopted one of the cherry trees to be her own. And then we have our tiny forest. So this is what it looked like after planting and once the fence had gone up. It's now got some little benches in there for the school children to use. And if you haven't heard of a tiny forest, this is done in conjunction with Earthwatch. And it is a really kind of unique idea, putting a completely different habitat into that area. So we'll have a real mosaic of different habitats. But it's 600 trees planted incredibly densely. They're all British natives. They're all chosen expressly to suit the soil in that particular place. And it's also done with kind of a lot of citizen science projects and monitoring data, and also in conjunction with all the schools. So it will be hopefully really used by the local community as well. And the other lovely kind of unseen benefit of having a tiny forest was we got loads of publicity. So we got in the BBC and the Guardian, UK Wildcraft made a YouTube video for us. And the result of all that publicity means we've had loads of people just come visit the site who didn't even know it was there or existed before. We've had people volunteer to be litter pickers. We've had people emailing us. We've had people subscribing to our email list. So it's actually been really helpful for us as Sustainable Southmead and all the other projects which we're now getting involved in, kind of having this draw. And then finally, Charlie asked if I could say something about the challenges which we faced. So there were two main challenges which I personally faced. First one was contacting people in the council to start with, and the second was kind of the negative assumptions and predictions that are always made whenever we tell anyone about what we're doing. The first thing we get back is, oh, I hope that lasts, and I hope the teenagers don't vandalise this like they did 30 years ago. But the contacts first. So I'd say just keep pushing, just keep emailing, but also find someone on the in. So local councillors are great. I'm not going to tell you who it was who got me on that mailing list in the first place because I don't want to get them in trouble, but they do actually have really good contacts. But then I've also seen that some of the people who were really useful to contact were here today. So in that networking bit, if you get to find the email address of someone on the council, that's a really good place to start. And my other key top tip would be whenever you can meet people, just meet them in person, meet them on the site, get as many different people together, because then you get all the different inputs and the different ideas and you can just have a conversation about it. And that was a really helpful thing that we did. And then when it comes to the negativity that can be out there about making changes and doing things differently, I'd say know why you're doing it. I mean, you're probably here at this conference because you feel really passionately about this anyway. For me, it was about joy. For me, it's about my own well-being. It's about having something that doesn't stress me out and helps me have a work-life balance. So just hold on to the reason why you're doing something. We try really hard to use positive publicity. I could show you a million photos of motorbikes in the river and depressing things like that. But actually, all of our Facebook, all of our Instagram, everything we do, we try to be really positive, because I think that just breeds positivity and it breeds an enthusiasm and a love for the area if you can show the good things that are there and the species that are there and everything great that's happening. And then finally, do it anyway. You know, if we didn't do anything because someone else was going to be negative about it, we'd never do anything. So I'd say just do it. If you know what you want to do, go for it. So yeah, so that's the end of my presentation.